Hello, everyone. So welcome to my talk on benchmarks. I hope you can hear me well, even though you can't, let me know. The reason why I decided to speak about benchmarks is because I think it's a very interesting topic, and I don't really see a lot of resources around it, right? So we all do benchmarking to some extent or some comparison of values, but we rarely talk about the best practices and the things that involve this problem. So I really wanted to kind of summarize all the things that go into it, all the decisions, or maybe not all of them, but most of them. And why did I decide to do it is kind of I started as a data nerd in my career, right? My background was statistics. And the more I started working in business in data science analytics, the more I found, that you can do very little without understanding the domain, right? So I basically I started working in digital marketing. We started doing things for Hollywood studios, which was very interesting. We did build some cool stuff like budget optimizations for Facebook before they even had one, or we did a lot of social listening. But over time, we started to shift more into marketing reporting and basically automating the analytics, right? So I'm kind of my passion is always trying to automate the data analysis so that, we as a marketer or data analyst don't have kind of to dig through all the data, but surface the insights automatically. And a big part of it is benchmarking. So understanding, what to compare and how to compare it. And I recently joined a Verity where I'm working on a similar product. And before we built around 3 or 4 benchmarking solutions or generations of benchmarking solutions in Panoramic. When I joined the Verity, they were just starting a benchmarking project. So I was like, hey, I know a thing about this. So I kind of started to discuss it. And it's always an interesting experience because it kind of depends on the company, on the setting, on the clients, and you always do something slightly different. So I just decided to also talk to it about a wider audience, right? Because we might get some feedback, inputs, and ideas, which I think is always great. And I've been speaking a lot of events previously, but this is actually the first one that's online. I always done in person, so it is a bit weird for me, but I hope it's you're used to it by now. And I also think speaking at marketing conferences as a tech person is very interesting and important because, as I mentioned, without understanding the domain, there's nothing really goes very well. And I'll talk about that also about the mistakes that I've made in the past in this area. So yeah, really looking forward to discussing benchmarks, and hopefully there will be some interesting questions. So what will we talk about, right? So I'll first try to talk a bit about how I see benchmarks, what I think benchmarks are. Then we will talk about local benchmarks, right? Because local benchmarks, from my perspective, are when you only have your own data, so your company data or data across multiple projects, but there's no other companies involved, right? Or maybe sister companies, so still kind of the same context. And then there's the global benchmarks, which talk a bit more about, let's say, if you're an agency and you want to create benchmarking for your clients, right? So we have maybe multiple clients from the same industry, and you want to create a comparison, right? And that kind of brings its own challenges. So I'll briefly focus on that, and then maybe I'll talk a bit about how I'm currently thinking about benchmarks and working with benchmarks. So having framed this, what are benchmarks, right? So essentially, you think about it, evaluating anything in marketing or anywhere else, it's just, comparing values, right? You always have the value of, let's say, your campaign performance, and you compare it to, some other value, which can be the last week's value. It can be a benchmark from, that you got from Google platform, or, it could also be a goal that you have, right, to see how you are tracking. So in the end, the analysis is always about comparison or contrasting a value, right? No value has a meaning on its own. Then there's always some expectation, right? So benchmarking basically means what's the norm, right? And we kind of have to agree on what the norm is. And once we have this norm, we can, start benchmarking. We can start actually evaluating our performance. So this is kind of what benchmarking means to me, high level. And now the question is, why should I kind of think about doing benchmarking myself and not just kind of reuse the platform benchmarks that are available? Before I dive into that, I'm not going to talk about how we calculate benchmarks, right? It can just be an average over all of your campaigns or all of your clients, or it can kind of go much finer grain, which I will talk about a bit. And basically, first thing is, with the benchmarks that are published publicly, right, you always have a bit of delay, right? So imagine on the onset of COVID, I think in some countries or just the beginning of Q2, right, the landscape can change pretty quickly. but you have to wait until there's a new set of benchmarks released, and it might always be the most convenient for you, right? So you can kind of get it at your own pace, however you want, right? Then the second thing is, you can't really dig very deep into the static benchmarks, right? So imagine that you have campaigns that are kind of very specific. Let's say for Hollywood, it was video view campaigns or very specific demographics or interest groups, right? So building your own benchmarks allows you to slice and dice as you want, right? And kind of always get the most relevant context available for kind of your use case, which is why I think it's very much worth it. Then you can benchmark anything, right? So we're not talking only about marketing data, right? You always most probably have some kind of a CRM system or sales data. So, you can benchmark that and also combine it with the benchmarks for marketing, right? So it kind of allows you to see a bigger picture of where you stand. So I think that's also a big advantage. And, obviously, as I mentioned, if you only have your data, you still can do benchmarks, right? Because you have your past performance, and, you basically can just see how you're doing within your own context. And that's always relevant, right? The global benchmarks I mentioned are also relevant, but the local ones are important too. So I talk about local benchmarks, and I'll talk about a few of the challenges that you might find when you think about doing the benchmarking yourself, right? And again, when I talk about doing benchmarking yourself, think about having an Excel sheet with all your campaign performance and aggregating it to some level, and then you can compare all the new campaigns to this kind of number. The first thing that seems very simple is what's the time period that we use for the benchmarking. So, and this might seem like a very trivial question, but I've actually seen two data scientists having a very heated debate about this topic, almost at the point of an argument. Because if you think about the short time period, let's say 3 months, it's kind of much more responsive. So again, think about COVID, right? Suddenly, many more companies are trying to advertise in the online space. CPMs can go up, right? So you want your benchmarks to reflect this, because if I just compare my data towards a stale benchmark, it's always going to look the same way, right? It's not going to give me all of information if all of my campaigns are suddenly over or under benchmarks. Then there's the longer time period, right? So you think about, let's say, taking 12 months, which means you have all kinds of seasonalities in there averaged. It's kind of much more stable, right? So sometimes you might want more stability. So that's kind of another aspect that you have to consider. And then there's a specific time period, right? So if I'm trying to evaluate my Black Friday campaigns, none of the other two benchmarks are going to give me a lot of value, right? So then when I'm trying to build this benchmarking, I have to keep all of this in mind. And I'll actually do a slight deep dive with the charts for this one. I won't do too many deep dives because I don't want to overwhelm anybody with data. But let's imagine that this is kind of basically our time series aggregated for our benchmarks throughout the past 365 days. Now you can see CPM in dollars on the y-axis. You have the dates on the x-axis, and you can see that there's quite some variance, right? So like the Black Friday is the highest point of CPM in in November or around November, right? So basically, there's multiple peaks, and this is like what your data might look like aggregated to a level. Actually, this is something that aggregated over multiple clients from retail. So it's actually a very clear trend. It's not just I wouldn't say small data, but there's quite a bit of spend behind it, right? So you can imagine millions of dollars. Right, and now imagine we pick a benchmark that's just for 3 months, and the period afterwards is kind of going to look very good, right, after the first 3 months, because there are a few spikes, and you can say, suddenly our CPMs are down, so it's a positive trend, and as you move on, in time, that might change, right? So this is kind of how the 3 months benchmark, what it would tell you when you do this comparison. Then if you kind of move on, right? So let's say that I have the 3 months that are spending the Black Friday event. This basically can mean that anything afterwards can look, very good, even though it's higher than before. It's kind of can look pretty decent simply because there were a few outliers before, and of course you can take care of these somehow. But if you just throw the aggregations over the data, this is what you would get. And it's again a question: does it bring any value to you or not? And then, obviously, let's say I benchmark Black Friday towards the 3 months before it, and thank you, Captain Obvious, right? I know that Black Friday has higher CPMs, right? So this is where the previous comparison doesn't make any sense or give me a lot of value, because without any data, I would know that the CPMs are probably going to be higher. And lastly, right, if I just take the whole year, I could just kind of average it, and I can kind of would get some value. It'll probably be slightly higher than kind of the low periods, right, because of the outliers. Or I could also just remove the outliers or do something about it, right? So these are kind of all the steps you have to go through to pick a time period and make sure that your time period is relevant. And you might say, oh, Roman, but I read this article, and we all know that averages are, a shitty metric, pardon my French. And I would just use median, right? And these very kind of actually collide a bit in tech, because the technical solution for building averages versus medians is pretty different. And a small change that you might expect to take, I don't know, a week or two on the tech side suddenly takes 2 or 3 months, right? So that's kind of why you need to make these changes beforehand and understand kind of the trade-offs. And yeah, obviously you can iterate, and you should always iterate. You shouldn't try to build the perfect solution right off the bat. It's just always good to be conscious of the limitations, right? That kind of brings me to a story that kind of happened to me in real life. So in the previous company, I actually had the privilege of attending the cool parties in LA, the Christmas parties, because I always went there before Christmas. And basically we had this system where we evaluated the performance of the media teams for their platforms, right? Because we have platform-specific teams. And we are doing this based on benchmarks that were combined into one composite score for each of the platforms, right? So you can imagine this green and red dot representing not just CPM, CPC, CPV, everything that was relevant for us, also with custom weights. And for some reason, we are always giving Google Ads a bad score, right? So like the team wasn't really excited about this system, and they actually created a band for the Christmas party. They were kind of, a lot of them had musical talents. And what happened is that they called their band the Red Dots in the honor of the system, or dishonor, because we always graded them kind of a bit unfairly, right? And what was behind this is, that the overall benchmark just didn't cut it, because I don't know how many of you have interacted with the Google Ads data, right? But like Google just dumps all of the data across YouTube, across search, across display, right? And obviously, when I just benchmark YouTube across all of AdWords, right? Or sorry, all of Google Ads, it doesn't really make sense, right? So it was a mistake on the kind of technical part, or not even a mistake, right? We just built a first simple iteration where we didn't do any breakdowns based on objective or network for AdWords, and this is what came out with, right? And it's for a technical perspective, it was simple to fix it, and we did, right? But we really needed to communicate with the business people, right? Because we just didn't know that at the time, right? So there was a lot of learning going on our end, and kind of always think about these solutions when you try them, that you will never get it perfect the first time. And also the more complexity you add, right, the more experience you gain, but you also always have to listen to the business to kind of make sense of the data. And just going further on this, we kind of had this debate with the media team that was ongoing, right? So you think about adding more dimensions, not just network, but age, gender, geo, right? There are some limitations, right? So first of all, the platforms don't just give you all the data that you want, right? It's not Pokemon. You can't get all the dimensions at the same time, because for example, Facebook will give you a report that has age and gender in it, and it will give you a report that has geo in it, but you can't get both at the same time, right? So you can still get age, gender, add objective to it, add platform to it, add position to it, right? But you will never be able to add geo to it. I mean, there are some hacky ways you could do this, but it's complicated, right? So you have this whole dilemma where, on one hand, you are trying to be the most objective when evaluating the campaigns. On the other hand, also, sometimes the people in the media team were set up in a way where they were thinking, I also want to look good in front of my boss, right? So if I, want to look good in front of my boss, there's probably a combination of dimensions I can pick that makes me look good, right? And is the question, is this a valid combination? Should we always look for the combinations that make us look better in front of our bosses, or should we kind of try to be the most objective, right? And the question is what objective actually means. And we set out to study this, right? So we are thinking, okay, so let's find the silver bullets, the combination of dimensions that is always the best, right? It was a very naive expectation, as you might have guessed, because there is no one size fits all, right? We live in the internet age of personalization. We know that there is rarely a one size fits all solution, but we still try to shoehorn these kind of problem into into kind of this category. And it turned out, obviously, there is no right answer, and that we kind of ended up designing a solution that only ended up being a prototype, which was trying to determine the right set of dimensions for each campaign, right? So obviously you were an advertiser and you were advertising in both, let's say, the India and the US, right? We'll make this automatic split to use it, right? But if you're an advertiser that only advertised in the US, right, we didn't have to do this, right? So we're trying to automate these decisions to be as objective as we can. And yeah, I mean, it was a prototype because in the end it was slightly more complex, and it was supposed to get into the further iterations, but I moved on before that. So, but it was an interesting solution. And then the global benchmarks, right? So I mentioned that these maybe more if you are an agency or you have more companies in your portfolio, right? Or if you're like a performance professional that manages multiple companies, right? You might think about, hey, I could just benchmark them against each other. And if you think about the kind of insight we are trying to generate from this, at first you might compare your campaign to your own benchmark when you say, oh, I'm doing quite well within my kind of context. And then you look at the global context and you see, actually, I'm not doing that great, right? So that means that I should look for improvements or for ideas and inspiration outside of my company, right? Whereas if my company is not doing that great within my own campaigns, I know that, there's still learnings I can extract from the other campaigns, right? Or I might just want to shift budgets towards the other campaigns, right? It's not always about learning. Sometimes it's more about being efficient. So that's why I think the global benchmarks add value. They add a lot of value, but they kind of also pose more challenges. So first of all, data isn't always the biggest challenge with global benchmarks, simply because suddenly you are mixing data from multiple clients together, right? So there's a data privacy issue, and you have to get consent from your clients. You kind of probably need to make sure that they trust you enough to mix their data, to anonymize their data, to not expose their data to their potential competitors or other companies, right? So you think about this, if I have two companies in automotive industry and I share the benchmarks with one of them, they could, using the benchmark and their own data, calculate the values for their competitor, which would be a pretty bad thing to happen, right? So you kind of have to have these safeguards in place for people to trust you or for the solution to actually make sense, right? And as I mentioned, trust is then the same thing, right? So the people have to trust the privacy aspect of it, but also I would say the data, right? Because you are not Google, right? Google has, hundreds of companies, right? So there's a good chance that the data is very relevant, but at the same time, if you have 3 or 4 clients, it might not always be the kind of most objective subset, right? And that's something that I just wanted to discuss on the next slide. So if you think about your clients, you need to make sure that they've somehow they are compatible in their makeup, right? What they are made of. So an example would be, you have a company in the same industry that's doing a lot of brand campaigns, right? So they care more about video views or clicks, right? And let's say 80% of their campaigns are video views, 80% are clicks, and the other one is currently more focusing on conversions, and they have 100% of conversion campaigns. You can aggregate them, but the benchmarks won't be really relevant to either of those. Like a good example would be, let's say you have the movie industry and you have a big movie studio like Sony in there and 9 indie movie studios, right? That means that the benchmark isn't really relevant to Sony because it's like in the big leagues category, and it's not even relevant for the. I mean, you can create a benchmark for the indie movie studios by themselves, right? But I wouldn't want to mix Sony into it simply because it's a completely different order of magnitude, right? So these are like all the things you have to consider when aggregating this data across multiple clients. And then there is also something in data analytics that's called Simpson's paradox, right? So this is more about relationships, right? So if you would be trying to use the benchmarks further, but I'll just dive a bit into the chart, right? So imagine that we have two clients, right? And we are trying to aggregate them. And we have, CPAs and spend, and I don't know how many of you have studied this effect, right? But very often on Facebook, if I kind of exhaust or target too much of my audience, right, I'm kind of getting to the people who are less and less likely to get engaged, because Facebook ranks the users, and scores them and serves them in order, in which they are likely to engage with your ads, right? So sometimes the more spend, the worse the results, right? So you can kind of the effect would make a lot of sense, right? So with more spend, the CPA goes higher. But then with aggregating the data, this trend might just reverse, right? Because algorithms can be very smart, but I like to say that they can also be very dumb. It's like also when aggregating data to the benchmark level, you need to kind of be also conscious of then further analyzing them, right? So this is another challenge that I would like to mention. And going further, right? So I would say the thing that I think is kind of interesting about currently the benchmarking solution I'm working on is we are kind of creating this industry catalog, and we are kind of trying to apply the smart benchmark, where we are kind of trying to see if you can dive into industry or sub-industry, depending on how many data you have, how consistent it is, right? So I think that's a very cool concept, and we kind of want to determine this automatically, right? So nobody has to lift a finger. And you kind of also need to work with anonymous data, which is a big challenge for the data scientists, right? Because it's very difficult to cross-check everything. And imagine that you have some bug that gets introduced into the pipeline, right? You don't know who to fix the bug for, right? So you can do like maybe some slicing and dicing, but it's also not ideal. And then in the end, we want to also give everybody the ability to explore benchmarks for other industries, right? So let's say you're an agency, you get a kind of new client from an industry, and you would just like to know what to expect, right? So we kind of want to offer this capability. So those are some of the things that I'm working on. And I would say like the biggest challenge is also when I mentioned the domain, right? So like when working with developers, it's always kind of interesting to see that they care a lot about the tech part of it. But then, when we're trying to think about the customer and the end user, kind of it's a bit outside of their reach, right? So I would say when working with tech teams, it's always important to understand this, right? And kind of try to meet halfway, right? So there's always a trade-off between the tech solution and the domain solution, and it should always be in favor of the domain. It just, that sometimes it's more difficult than the other times. Oh, yeah. So if I had to summarize, I would say that, when you are thinking about building your own benchmarking solution, you always have to consider the trade-offs. So think about, the things that you want to have in there that are the most important for you, prioritize them, and then see how difficult they are to build, right? So always try to start simple and iterate from there. I don't try to build a perfect solution. There's even a saying in product management that says, done is better than perfect. So don't forget about this, right? It's always not just about the technology, right? So you have to have the clients trust you. You kind of also need to understand the domain, which I think most of you being in the marketing domain understand. And then, as I mentioned, using benchmarks requires a mindset, right? So you have to have an open mind. You have to accept that sometimes the benchmarks will make you look bad, right? Even though that's not the goal, right? So we're always trying to improve, to kind of do the best for our clients. Sometimes that might mean, saying, oh, this is not working as well as we expected it, right? So that's also, I think, very important to consider. So yeah, I would say I didn't take a lot of the time, but these are some of the most interesting challenges you would find when trying to do benchmarking yourself, right? And always, if you think about benchmarks, they're not that difficult to then combine with the original data, but that's a whole other chapter, right? So this, from my perspective, the most important part is benchmarks. So I hope you do have some questions, and if not, you can if you something comes to your mind later, feel free to reach out or to ask a question, right? As I mentioned, we are working on benchmarks right now. We will be kind of releasing a solution that people will be able to use, but also don't just hesitate to reach out to me to ask questions. I'm always happy to share knowledge. As I mentioned, the cooperation of, if there's one thing that you take away from this, cooperation between the people who are technical and the people who are business oriented is always kind of what yields the best results. And without this cooperation, I don't think it makes sense to build any tool. So yeah, that's what I wanted to say today. I don't know if there are any questions. I don't see any. Okay, so since we don't have any questions, maybe we can try some polls if some people are still staying on. See, there are still some people. Let me check. I'm not sure how to actually make a poll. So I'll be actually interested in how many of you are using benchmarks, right? And how many of you have thought about it, and what were the kind of biggest barriers that you've encountered. So let me just maybe try to do a poll. So yeah. Have a bit of trouble with the polling system, so we can leave it up for later, or you can just message me if you're interested. And I think we're going to end the session now. So again, thank you for attending. I hope some of this was interesting to you. I hope it was somewhat useful to you. I hope that you are either using benchmarking or you want to give it a try. So good luck with that.